Okay, so the next section is combining real numbers. Okay, real numbers we discussed in the very first unit. Remember, real numbers incorporates pretty much every type of number with the exception of imaginary numbers, which we haven't gotten to in this class yet since we just started. But we will get there. But for right now, we're just looking at those real numbers. So remember, rational, irrational, whole numbers, natural numbers, all of that stuff fits under the realm of real numbers. Okay? So adding, this is going to be basically, do we remember our negatives and positive signs and all the rules that go along with them? So when you're talking about addition, we all know that 3 plus 2 is equal to 5. Okay, and what does that look like on the number line? Okay, well, essentially that means if I started at 3, okay, so I started 0, we go over 3 there, okay, so there's my 3, and then if I go 2 more from there, okay, that's going to be the plus 2 part, and that would get me to 5. Okay, so that's essentially what you're looking at. Okay, if I started at 3 and I add 2 more, I end up at 5. Well, when you talk about negative numbers, it works the same sort of way. So, negative 1 plus negative 2 is going to be a negative 3, and here's why. So if I start at negative 1, okay, and I add 2 more negatives, so 2 more negatives would go to the left, right? Well, that's what that adding negative 2, or subtracting, if you will. Okay, that's plus a negative 2. So if I add 2 more negatives, I end up over here at negative 3. So that's essentially all that it's working with. When you're talking about positive, you're moving to the right. When you talk about negatives, you're moving to the left on this number line. Okay, so adding 2 numbers with the same sign. Okay, if I'm adding 2 numbers with the same sign, add their absolute value, so add the actual number itself, okay, the distance away from 0, and use their common sign as a sign of the sum. Okay, use the common sign. So for instance, if they are both negative, okay, you add the absolute values, the absolute value of negative 3 plus the absolute value of negative 7. Now you don't have to write this out every time. This is just conceptually what's happening. Okay, so that would be 3 plus 7, which is 10, and you keep the common sign. So they are both negative, so it equals negative 10. Okay, negative because they're both negative. And that's all that's really happening here. In E-G-A-T-I-V. There we go again with that spelling and talking thing. Okay, so that's really what's happening. You add the numbers because I've got negative 3 and I'm going to go less 7 from there and I'm going to end up at negative 10. Okay, add the numbers together. 3 plus 7 is 10. Put the negative because they're both negative. So same thing here, 5 plus 7 is just positive 12. Okay, 5 and 7 make 12, and they're both positive, so the answer is positive. Okay, negative 2 plus negative 10, I'm adding 2 negatives, so you get 2 plus 10 is 12, and they're both negative, so the answer is negative. That's all that you're really looking at. Okay, this is just a quick rule reminder to make sure we know how to deal with our negatives, because you're not going to have a calculator to use to do that with. So here we've got negative 4, positive 6. Okay, and here's where people tend to mess up when we do this stuff mathematically. So if I start at negative 4 and I add 6, then I would go 6 to the right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to the right. Here's my plus 6. Well, that leaves me at positive 2. Positive 2. So negative 4 plus 6 is equal to a positive 2, and that's why. Because remember, plus 6 you go right, negative 6 you would move left. Okay, so adding 2 numbers with different signs is very easy. Subtract the smaller absolute value. Okay, so the smaller absolute value. So again, here we're looking at just the number, ignore the sign. Okay, so like the smaller number is 3. The smaller number is 5. The smaller number is 2. We're ignoring the value of it. I know negative 10 is actually smaller than negative 2. But we're ignoring the value and just looking at that absolute value, so what the actual number is. Okay, so you subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger absolute value. Okay, and then you use the sign of the number whose. There should be a whose in there. So whose absolute value is larger as the same sign of the sum. Okay, let me say this. Oh my God, I confused myself in this sentence. So use the sign of the number whose absolute value is larger as the sign of the sum. So what should happen there is whichever absolute value was the largest, that's going to be the sign that we're going to use. So for instance here, okay, positive 3 and negative 7. So it says subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger absolute value. Okay, so we get 7 minus 3, which is equal to 4. Okay, 7 minus 3, which is equal to 4. Well, the largest absolute value was negative, so my answer is negative. Okay, the largest absolute value was the 7, so that's going to be, it was negative, so your answer is negative. So same thing here, negative 2, positive 10. So you go 10 minus 2, which is 8. Okay, so 8 is going to be our number. The largest absolute value was positive 10, so the answer is positive. Okay, another example. Okay, this works with decimals as well, and hopefully we remember how to subtract decimals. Okay, so we've got 0.5 minus 0.2, which is going to give me 0.3, and the larger absolute value was the negative 0.5, so the answer is negative 0.3. Okay, remember that to subtract decimals, you have to line up your decimals and you just subtract straight down. Okay, so then negative 3/8 plus 2/5. Now we already did this with fractions, so you're going to have to actually common denominator this. Remember, if you're adding or subtracting, you must have a common denominator. Okay, so we're going to go first. Let's do that. So the common denominator between 8 and 5 is 40. Okay, so we're going to times 8 here, top and bottom. We're going to times 5 here, top and bottom. So that gives me negative 15 over 40 plus 16 over 40. Okay, so negative 15 plus 16 over 40, which I could really just rewrite 16 over 40 minus 15 over 40, which is just 1 over 40. Okay, and the larger number there was positive, so my answer should be positive, and it is. Okay, last one here, negative 1.1 and positive 0.6. Okay, negative 1.1, positive 0.6. We're going to go 1.1 minus 0.6. Notice I line up my decimals here. Okay, so I'm going to borrow. We get 0, we get 11, so this is going to be, the decimal goes straight down. I get 0.5. Okay, so 0.5. My largest absolute value was negative, so my answer is negative. So negative, oops, can't see that, negative 0.5. Okay, so that would be your answer there, negative 0.5. Okay, so that's adding two numbers with different signs. Okay, adding two numbers with different signs. So now opposites are additive inverses. Okay, you do have to know this vocabulary, so pay attention to the vocabulary. Okay, two numbers that are the same distance from 0 but lie on opposite sides of 0 are called opposites. Okay, that's why they're opposites. They're on opposite sides of the 0, or additive inverses. Okay, so the additive inverses, if I add them together, I should get 0. Okay, so because we're talking about distance, so if I add the distances together, I should get 0. Okay, so if I go positive 2 and negative 2 together, they give me 0. Those are called additive inverses or opposites. Okay, so 2 and negative 2 are opposites, or additive inverses. Okay, now there's going to be different things, different vocabulary words that you're going to have to learn here, so make sure that you really pay attention. These will show up in your test, they will show up in homework, they will show up in quizzes, so you have to be able to describe numbers. If I gave you 2 and negative 2, you have to be able to tell me what kind they are, and there's going to be different types. There's additive inverses, there's also multiplicative inverses, and we'll discuss those in just a minute, okay? But essentially, if they're opposites of each other, so one's positive, one's negative, that's really all it is. So 1/2 and -1/2 is another example. Okay, 3 and -3. Those would be opposites or additive inverses of each other. Okay, because if I put them together, I get 0. So that's the additive inverse. Now we also have, oh, there's some examples. I didn't realize there's more examples on the other side. Okay, so if you look at these examples, which I believe for you are, yeah, no, yours are on the other side also. Okay, so when you're looking at them, okay, you should immediately notice that these right here are opposites. Okay, they're just opposites. If I put them together, I should get 0. -3 and +3, 0. +1/2 and -1/2, 0. Notice they did the additive there because it's the additive inverse. Okay, so 1/2 plus -1/2 is 0. That makes all of these opposites of each other. Okay, the sum of a number A and its opposite is 0 all the time. That's your rule. A plus -A is 0. So whatever A is, okay, if I have its negative, then they're going to add up to be 0. Okay, not really a difficult concept. It's really the vocabulary you need to be aware of. Okay, that additive inverse. I can't say that enough. Okay, so we use negative to represent the opposite of or the additive inverse of. So for instance, if I'm talking about -5 is what they give me, a -5 is the additive inverse. Okay, so that's +5. -5 equals a +5. So that's going to be the additive inverse there. Okay, so subtraction. Okay, hopefully we all know how to subtract. We know 9 minus 7 is 2. We also know that 9 plus -7 equals 2. So that means those two things are equivalent. That's all it's saying here. 9 minus 7 is 9 plus -7. Those are the same exact thing. Okay, again, all rules we should be very familiar with. Just want to make sure. I forgot to label this. Okay, this first one means the opposite of. Okay, -5 is what this piece says. This is really just kind of how you how it reads out. Okay, the opposite of -5 is +5. Okay, the opposite of, that's what that first negative means. The opposite of -5 is +5. Okay, so that's all that really says. That's just written out in words. Okay, so now back down to here. 9 minus 7 is 2, we know. 9 plus -7, 2 is, we know. Okay, so you do need to be able to do these. Okay, if A and B are real numbers, then A minus B and A plus -B are the same. That is your rule. Okay, not really a difficult rule. We should already be aware of that. So for instance, -13 minus 4 is the same as -13 plus -4. Okay, and we discussed how to do that already. They're adding the same sign, so you add them together. 13 plus 4 is 17, and both signs are negative, so the answer is negative. Okay, so same sort of thing here. Okay, you have to remember that when you have minus a negative, okay, that minus a negative, that's essentially saying the opposite of a negative is positive. So this is the same thing as saying 5 plus 6. So when you subtract a negative, it becomes positive, and that's equal to 11. Okay, so same thing here. This is the same thing as saying -3/10 plus -5/10. Okay, so when you put those together, I would get -8/10, because I'm going to add those two numbers. 3/10 plus 5/10 is 8/10, and then keep the sign. And then we're going to have to reduce. Remember, every time you have a fraction in this class, you will reduce it. You will never not reduce it. Okay, so 8/10, you do need to reduce it. Just so you know, the way that I grade, you will lose points if you do not reduce it. Okay, it's usually like partial points or something like that, but you will lose points if you do not reduce your fractions. Okay, so we get -4/5. Last one here, I got 5.3 minus -4.6, so that's the same thing as saying 5.3 plus 4.6. I'm going to do it vertically so that I can do it by hand here. That decimal drops there down. 6 plus 3 is 9, 5 plus 4 is 9, so it's 9.9, and those are both positive, so it equals 9.9. Okay, again, line up your decimals, add straight down. Okay, line up those decimals, add straight down. Okay, so then this last little part is just combining the second section of this unit where we did order of operations. Okay, so we're going to use our order of operations and our new signs rules in order to evaluate these, not solve, right? There's no equal sign, so it's evaluate. So simplify and evaluate expressions with real numbers. So parentheses first. Remember PEMDAS. If you need to, write it down. Okay, PEMDAS. Parentheses comes first, and you go to the innermost parentheses. So -2 minus 5, which is the same thing as saying -2 plus -5. Okay, that's the same thing. So I get -3 plus bracket. -2 plus -5 is -7. Minus 2, close that. Okay, so all I've done is this part right here became -7. Okay, now the next part, I still have parentheses, so we need to get rid of that. Okay, so we've got -3 plus, okay, -7 minus 2. Well, that's the same thing as saying -7 plus -2, which is -9. Okay, and you can keep your brackets here. You can switch them to parentheses. It's not going to matter. When we have multiple sets, we tend to not use 2 sets of parentheses because it gets confusing. So instead, you're going to use parentheses and brackets. That's why those brackets show up. Okay, just because if you get too many parentheses in there, it's hard to follow how many you've opened and closed and all that stuff. So if you use a set of brackets, it makes it a little easier to follow. Okay, so -7 plus a -2 makes a -9. So now I've got -3 plus -9. Okay, same sign, so it's going to add the numbers. 3 plus 9 is 12. Keep that negative sign. There's your answer. So here we go again. Okay, working with the innermost set of parentheses first. Okay, so I've got parentheses first. So here I'm going to do those. 2 cubed minus the absolute value of 10. Now, some of you might be thinking, can't I do each one of these pieces individually? Yes, you can. You can do them all in one step individually, but just for making sure we follow PEMDAS, because some people find it confusing, so I don't want to start mixing it up and doing too many things at one time is what I'm trying not to do. Okay, so I'm going to go with my extra set of parentheses. So -6 minus -5, so that's -6 plus 5. Okay, so inside that set of parentheses is -1, so plus a -1, right? Because you do 6, they're opposite signs. So 6 minus 5 is 1, keep the sign of the larger number. Okay, so that's -1. So now, after parentheses, we've got exponents. Well, we got to remember that this counts as a set of parentheses too, so we can go ahead and do that as well. So 2 cubed, the absolute value of 10 is 10. Notice that that minus outside doesn't change. Only minuses inside the absolute value would change, not outside. So we keep minus 10, okay, and that's plus -1. I'm going to switch to parentheses because it doesn't matter. So now exponents, so 2 to the third power is 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8. Okay, make sure you do 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8, minus 10. Helps if I can write 10. And then plus -1, and now just go left to right. So 8 minus 10 is -2 plus -1. Okay, add those together, you get -3. Okay, now C asked me to evaluate for x equal to and y equals -5. So here they give me values for both x and y. So we're going to plug them in to each one of these. There's 2 separate ones happening here. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a line so I don't get them confused. Okay, so starting with this one, plug in a 2 for every x. So I've got 2 minus y is -5. So I'm going to plug in the whole -5. Notice that I don't just use this negative for this one. Okay, when it's minus y, so that's minus -5. Over 12 plus x, well, x is still 2. Okay, so I used that x value twice because there's 2 x's. Okay, so then 2 minus -5 becomes 2 plus 5. Over 12 plus 2 is 14. We can go ahead and do that. So I get 7 over 14. We do not leave it like that. We must reduce. Okay, remember 14 breaks into 7 and 2, so those 7's go away and I'm left with 1/2. Okay, so I'm left with 1/2. Now that's one of them. There's still one more up there to do. As soon as I unfreeze my computer screen. Okay, so same sort of thing we're going to plug in. So I'm going to go 2 squared minus -5, just substituting in. Okay, order of operations. Exponents first. 2 squared is 4. Minus -5 becomes plus 5, which is just 9. Okay, so you get 9 for the answer there. Okay, and that's all there really is to combining real numbers. Again, should be super familiar, but some of us have kind of gotten rusty over the summer, so we want to make sure we go back over and cover those nice little those negative signs, and make sure we can add and subtract with negatives in there. Okay, next we'll do multiplying and dividing.